The Korvani Defense Academy perched on asteroid Theta 7 like a chrome tumor against the void, its designers having apparently confused imposing military fortress with really expensive paperweight that shoots lasers. Admiral Vextar stood before the panoramic viewport of his command deck, his reptilian features reflecting the cold starlight as he contemplated the mathematical perfection of galactic warfare. Well, what passed for mathematical perfection when you had 7 different species arguing about optimal plasma dispersal patterns while their coffee got cold? The Academy represented the pinnacle of interstellar military cooperation, which was a diplomatic way of saying everyone agreed to put their second-best strategists in one place so they could feel important while not accidentally starting wars. The Korvani had volunteered their asteroid because, frankly, nobody else wanted the liability insurance premiums that came with housing the galaxy's most explosive egos in one convenient target. Vextar's scales rippled with what might have been pride or indigestion as he reviewed the morning briefings. The Academy had attracted the finest tactical minds from 12 different species, each convinced their particular brand of organized violence represented the evolutionary apex of military thinking. The Korvani specialized in overwhelming firepower, naturally. The Zephyrians preferred elegant precision strikes. The Grelux just hit things until they stopped moving, which was honest if not sophisticated. And then there were the humans. The exchange program had seemed like such a reasonable idea 6 months ago. Cultural understanding, tactical diversity, all those buzzwords that made committee meetings feel productive. The Terran Federation had sent exactly 1 cadet, which should have been the first warning sign. Most species sent delegations. Humans sent Zara Chen and a care package of something called instant ramen that had caused 3 different contamination alerts. Chen had arrived with credentials that looked impressive on paper and a demeanor that suggested she'd rather be literally anywhere else in the galaxy. Her psychological profile read like a technical manual written by someone with a profound distrust of adjectives. Competent, observant, cooperative. The kind of bureaucratic poetry that meant either criminally boring or hiding something interesting. Professor Quilneth had drawn the short straw for Chen's tactical analysis course, which was unfortunate because the insectoid took military theory as seriously as other species took religion. His compound eyes could track 17 different variables simultaneously. His mind processed battlefield logistics like a quantum computer having a good day, and his lectures had been known to make grown Grelux weep with their mathematical beauty. Today we examine the theoretical applications of concentrated defensive positioning, Quilneth announced to his mixed-species classroom, his mandibles clicking with academic enthusiasm. The holographic display showed Theta 7 in perfect detail, every weapon emplacement and shield generator rendered in clinical blue light. Note the elegant distribution of our primary weapon clusters, the sophisticated overlapping fields of fire. Chen raised a hand. Just raised it. Like she was asking for permission to use the bathroom. Yes, Cadet Chen. The Eastern plasma batteries. Her voice carried that peculiar human inflection that somehow made statements sound like questions. They seem positioned for maximum coverage. Quilneth's antennae twitched with barely concealed condescension. Indeed. Optimal firing solutions across all approach vectors. Standard galactic defensive doctrine, perfected over millennia of. Right. Chen nodded earnestly, like a student grateful for the explanation. It's just, well, I'm probably wrong, but wouldn't incoming ships expect that? The standard positioning, I mean. The silence that followed could have been weaponized. Cadet Thexmol, whose species had invented orbital bombardment before they'd figured out the wheel, made a sound like grinding machinery. Lieutenant Vashti's tentacles curled in what her people considered profound embarrassment for someone else. Expectation, Quilneth said slowly, is accounted for in defensive theory through lead redundancy and crossfire matrices. The positioning is standard because it is optimal. Oh, absolutely. Chen's agreement came so quickly it almost sounded genuine. I just wondered if there might be, I don't know, different ways to think about optimal, but you're the expert. Professor Quilneth spent the rest of the class explaining why Chen was wrong with the kind of methodical thoroughness usually reserved for dismantling particularly stubborn enemy fortifications. Chen nodded at appropriate intervals, asked clarifying questions that demonstrated her complete acceptance of superior galactic wisdom, and took notes in handwriting that looked like controlled explosions. What nobody noticed was Captain Morthak's puzzled expression during his routine security briefing the next morning. Morthak's species had evolved from living crystals, which meant his thought processes operated on geological timescales and with mineral-based logic that considered most problems temporary inconveniences. He noticed things the way mountains noticed erosion, slowly, but with absolute certainty that something had changed. "Admiral," he said, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer, "the Eastern plasma battery efficiency ratings have improved by 12% overnight." Vextar paused in his morning ritual of glaring at status reports while consuming stimulants that would kill most carbon-based life forms. Improved how? Minor recalibrations in targeting subroutines. Optimal firing solutions now factor in 73 additional variables. The adjustments appear to have been made during routine maintenance cycles. And this is unusual. Morthak's crystalline features shifted in what might have been concern or crystalline digestion. The maintenance was scheduled. The specific improvements were not. They appear to have been implemented by initiative. Initiative was the kind of word that made military commanders break out in hives. Initiative suggested thinking, and thinking suggested someone had decided the official way of doing things might be improved upon, which was a kind of heretical notion that made entire command structures nervous. Investigate, Vextar decided, which was his solution to most problems that couldn't be solved by shooting them. Meanwhile, Chen attended her next tactical analysis class with the same earnest attention that had made her previous questions so memorably naive. Today's lesson covered sensor array positioning, and Chen had some thoughts. "The deep space scanners," she said, raising her hand with that same innocent timing. "They're monitoring the approaches from Galactic North, right?" "Correct," Quilneth confirmed, probably wondering if humans had some peculiar educational tradition that required stating the obvious. "Standard early warning configuration." "That makes total sense. It's just..." Chen paused, apparently struggling with complex concepts. "Do ships always come from the directions we're watching?" The question hit the classroom like a particularly dense asteroid. Cadet Zrelnox, whose species had been conducting space warfare since before humans had figured out fire, made a noise like escaping hydraulic fluid. Even Quilneth's compound eyes seemed to refocus independently, as if trying to process the sheer audacity of the question. "Cadet Chen," Quilneth said with the patience of someone explaining basic physics to a particularly dim asteroid, "sensor coverage is positioned according to probability matrices derived from thousands of years of tactical analysis. Ships approach from the directions they approach from because those are the tactically viable approach vectors." "Right, of course." Chen's nod suggested she was grateful for the clarification. "It's just that humans have this weird habit of not doing what makes tactical sense. But that's probably just us being, human." The rest of the class was spent explaining to Chen why her species' apparent tactical randomness was actually a sign of their primitive understanding of proper military doctrine. Chen absorbed this wisdom with the gratitude of someone finally understanding why they'd been doing everything wrong. Security Chief Wondrix discovered the sensor array improvements during her weekly system diagnostics. Wondrix existed as a conscious electromagnetic field that had learned to manipulate matter through sheer irritation at the universe's inefficiency, which made her uniquely qualified to notice when complex systems started behaving better than they were supposed to. "The deep space scanners," she reported to Admiral Vextar, her voice crackling with the kind of static that suggested controlled frustration, "have developed new scanning patterns. Autonomous adaptation protocols that shouldn't exist." "Shouldn't exist how?" "The arrays are now monitoring 17 additional approach vectors that were previously considered tactically irrelevant. They appear to be operating under the assumption that enemy forces might not follow standard tactical doctrine." Vextar's scales performed a complex rippling pattern that indicated deep thought, mild indigestion, or both. And these improvements happened overnight, during scheduled maintenance, by initiative. There was that word again. Initiative was starting to feel less like a bureaucratic inconvenience and more like a recurring nightmare. The pattern might have remained unnoticed if not for Chen's third class, where she asked Professor Quilneth about communication, relay positioning with the same innocent curiosity that had marked her previous inquiries. Her questions about redundancy and signal routing were answered with the same condescending thoroughness, and she accepted the explanations with the same grateful humility. 24 hours later, the Academy's communication network had spontaneously developed backup protocols that shouldn't have been possible with their existing hardware. Captain Morthak presented his findings to Admiral Vextow with the methodical precision of someone who had spent considerable time ensuring he wasn't hallucinating. Sir, the correlation is statistically impossible to ignore. Every system improvement has occurred within 8 hours of Cadet Chen's tactical analysis classes. You're suggesting, Vextar said slowly, that a human cadet is somehow upgrading our military systems by asking stupid questions. I'm suggesting, Morthak replied with crystalline certainty, that our questions may not be as stupid as they appear. This revelation hit Admiral Vextar like a plasma torpedo to the ego. The possibility that a species they categorized as enthusiastic but primitive might actually understand something about military tactics that the galaxy's finest strategists had missed was the kind of thought that made him want to hide in his quarters and pretend to be a civilian. But duty called, and duty had a nasty habit of calling at the worst possible moments. The emergency faculty meeting convened in Conference Room Alpha, which was what happened when the Academy needed to have serious discussions about things that might make them look stupid. Professor Quilneth arrived with data tablets. Chief Wondrix manifested as a particularly agitated electromagnetic field, and Captain Morthak brought the kind of mineral patience that suggested he'd already accepted whatever horrible truth they were about to discover. Gentlemen, lady, conscious energy field, Admiral Vextar began, which was his standard greeting for mixed-species meetings. We have a problem, or possibly an opportunity. Or possibly both, which would be just our luck. He activated the holographic display, showing the Academy's defensive improvements over the past month. The upgrades were subtle but comprehensive: efficiency increases, coverage improvements, adaptive protocols that seemed to anticipate problems before they occurred. Every improvement, he continued, corresponds to classes where Cadet Chen asked her questions. Professor Quilneth's mandibles clicked in agitation. So, with respect, the human's questions demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of established tactical doctrine. Her suggestions are naive at best. And yet, Chief Wondrix crackled, our systems keep getting better after she asks them. The silence that followed was the kind that preceded either brilliant insights or spectacular career-ending disasters. Captain Morthak, who had experienced both over his geological lifespan, decided to break it. Perhaps, he rumbled, we should test the correlation directly. Which was how the Academy found itself conducting an unscheduled tactical exercise the following week, with Cadet Chen invited to observe from the command center as a learning experience. The scenario was straightforward: a simulated attack by unknown forces using unconventional approach vectors and adaptive tactics. The simulation began badly and got worse from there. The attacking forces ignored standard tactical doctrine with a kind of creative malice that suggested they'd studied it specifically to do everything wrong. They approached from impossible angles, used weapons configurations that made no theoretical sense, and seemed to delight in making the Academy's defenses look like expensive decorations. This is ridiculous, Professor Quilneth muttered as another wave of simulated attackers slipped through their carefully positioned defensive matrix. No actual enemy would employ such irrational tactics. Chen, who had been watching the display with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for particularly interesting traffic accidents, raised her hand tentatively. Admiral? If I could would it help if you moved the plasma batteries about 15 degrees galactic south and staggered their firing sequences? The suggestion was so casual it almost went unnoticed. Vextar, who was watching his perfect defenses get methodically dismantled by simulated idiots, was desperate enough to try anything. Do it, he ordered. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The relocated batteries caught the next attack wave in a crossfire that the simulated enemies clearly hadn't expected. Their formation collapsed into confused fragments that the secondary defenses picked off with embarrassing ease. And maybe, Chen added, sounding almost apologetic for the interruption, if you could route sensor data through the communication relays? The attackers seemed to be using some kind of adaptive jamming, but the comrades on different frequencies. The sensor blackouts that had been plaguing the defense suddenly cleared, revealing the attacking forces' actual positions and movement patterns. What had seemed like random chaos resolved into a comprehensible tactical picture that the Academy's systems could finally address properly. "One more thing," Chen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They are probably going to try flanking through the asteroid field in about 3 minutes. If you could just adjust the mining sensor array to active scanning mode." Admiral Vextar stared at the tactical display as his supposedly impregnable fortress transformed from elaborate target to actual military installation. The attacking simulation, which had been systematically dismantling their defenses, found itself caught in overlapping fields of fire, tracked by sensors it couldn't jam, and outmaneuvered by adaptive tactics it couldn't predict. The simulation ended with a kind of decisive victory that military academies used in recruitment videos. The command center fell silent except for the gentle hum of systems that were now working considerably better than their specifications suggested they should. Professor Quilneth was the first to speak, his voice carrying the tone of someone whose worldview had just been thoroughly renovated without his permission. "How did you know to do that?" Chen looked genuinely confused by the question. "Do what? You mean the batteries? They just seemed wrong where they were. Like, if you were attacking, wouldn't you expect them to be in the standard positions?" "But the calculations," Quilneth insisted. "The firing solutions, the coverage matrices, the theoretical optimization protocols." "Oh, I don't know about any of that," Chen admitted cheerfully. "I just thought about where I'd put guns if I wanted to surprise someone trying to attack this place. And then I thought about where I'd put sensors if I wanted to see them coming. And then I thought about what would happen if everything was connected so it could share information instead of operating independently." The silence that followed was the kind that made Chief Wondrix's electromagnetic field fluctuate with what might have been amusement or existential crisis. Captain Morthak, whose geological perspective on time had given him a certain philosophical acceptance of sudden paradigm shifts, asked the question that was troubling everyone. "And you determined these optimal positions by looking at them?" Chen seemed genuinely puzzled that this required explanation. "I mean, it's just pattern recognition, right? You look at what you have, you think about what someone else might do, and you figure out how to make it harder for them to do it." Admiral Vextar felt something that might have been understanding dawning like a particularly uncomfortable sunrise. "Cadet Chen, when you ask your questions in class." "Oh, I'm not really asking questions," Chen said, looking slightly embarrassed. "I'm just pointing out things that seem weird. But everyone always explains why they are not weird, so I figure I must be wrong. It's nice that the systems keep getting better, though. Makes the place feel safer." The revelation that followed was the kind that military historians would later categorize as awkward and inevitable in retrospect. The Academy's faculty had spent months explaining to their human exchange student why her primitive tactical instincts were wrong, while she had spent months quietly demonstrating why their advanced theoretical frameworks might benefit from occasional reality checks. Her vague answers had been vague because she wasn't answering the questions they thought they were asking. They had been asking about doctrine and theory and established best practices. She had been observing problems and suggesting solutions with the kind of practical directness that comes from a species that learned warfare by necessity rather than tradition. The improvements to their systems hadn't been mysterious overnight upgrades. They had been the result of maintenance crews who, after listening to yet another lecture about why the human was wrong, had quietly wondered if maybe she wasn't entirely wrong, and had made subtle adjustments to test the hypothesis. In the weeks that followed, the Academy's defensive capabilities continued to improve as Chen attended more classes and asked more seemingly innocent questions about everything from supply logistics to crew rotation schedules. Her suggestions were always presented as casual observations from someone who clearly didn't understand proper military science. The faculty learned to recognize the pattern. Chen would identify something that seemed weird to her human perspective. They would explain why it wasn't weird according to established doctrine. She would accept their explanation with grateful humility. And then, somehow, that particular system would start working better. The final irony came during Chen's graduation ceremony, when Admiral Vextar presented her with a certificate of completion in advanced tactical studies. She accepted the honor with the same modest confusion that had characterized her entire stay at the academy. "I'm not sure I learned much," she admitted to the assembled faculty. "But I did enjoy the discussions. It's fascinating how different species approach the same problems." Professor Quilneth, who had spent the past months having his understanding of tactical doctrine quietly revolutionized by someone he'd been trying to educate, managed what might have been a smile. Indeed, Cadet Chen. Most educational. As Chen's transport departed Theta 7, the Academy settled into its new role as one of the galaxy's most genuinely formidable defensive installations. The improvements she had inspired continued to evolve, as maintenance crews and tactical officers found themselves thinking about problems from angles that doctrine hadn't previously considered. Admiral Vextar stood at his viewport, watching the human transport disappear into hyperspace, and reflected on the curious nature of education. The Academy had been designed to teach the galaxy's finest military minds the established principles of warfare. Instead, it had learned that sometimes the finest military mind belonged to someone who had never heard of the established principles and was therefore free to ignore them entirely. The defense map updates continued long after Chen's departure, as the Academy's systems adapted and evolved according to principles that had never been formally documented but somehow made perfect sense once you stopped thinking about why they shouldn't work. It was, Admiral Vextar mused, a remarkably human approach to military science. Ignore the theory, solve the problem, and let someone else figure out why it worked after the fact. The Academy's new motto, suggested by Chief Wondrix and approved by unanimous vote, reflected this philosophical shift. Optimal is overrated. Effective is eternal. Nobody bothered to translate it for the official records. Some wisdom, they had learned, was best left deliberately vague.